Started a lesson talking about the struggles that we have sometimes with being lukewarm. And you'll recall that we went to the book of Haggai. And Haggai came to the people of Israel who had gone back to rebuild the temple. And that building had actually stopped. And in essence, their excuse was, this is not the time to build the temple. And so they were building for themselves paneled houses while the temple was in ruins. And so Haggai says from God, consider your ways. You need to think about what you're doing. And he points out to them that you've sown much, but you've harvested little. You eat, but never enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You have clothes, but you're never warm. You put your money in a bag with holes in it. It feels like that almost all the time, doesn't it? You know, that it's never quite as much as we would like. So he said, consider your ways. And what he's trying to get them to realize is because of their improper priorities, their life is not the way that they expected it would be when they went back. And part of it is because they said, well, it's not time. And David Johnson Jr. a little bit earlier read for us the letter to the church at Laodicea, which talked to them about this problem of being lukewarm. And he warns them and says to them, I know your works. And I always want to remind us, they were doing stuff, but they were neither hot nor cold. And that's kind of the essence of lukewarmness, right? If they were cold, they'd be doing nothing. Or they'd be doing wrong things. But he says, I know your works, but it's just lukewarm. It's not hot. And this is the problem with lukewarmness, is it deceives us. It makes us feel comfortable, that everything's okay, that things are going the way that we want. And so we kind of get comfortable and we kind of just float along spiritually before God. And so we've been looking at what are some reasons that we have this lukewarmness in our own lives. And so I thought of 5 things in the Bible that point to why we might be lukewarm. And just so you know, in some ways, these are very personal to me, or I wouldn't have thought of them that this fit. These might not fit why you're lukewarm, but are suggestions for further ways of considering your ways. So the first one that we talked about last week is that I fear God more than I love God. So it's not that we don't honor God by fear, but that we're motivated almost completely by fear instead of love. The second was that I'm distracted by the world more than I'm fruitful for God. And this comes from the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, that it's so easy that we get caught up in the cares of this life and the riches, the deceitfulness of riches, he says, that the world becomes our focus instead of God. And that one fits very well with what we see happening with the Israelites in Jerusalem rebuilding the temple. They were living in paneled houses. God's house was in ruins. They cared more about where they lived than in honoring God. The third one that we talked about is that I'm satisfied with myself, I'm satisfied with my life more than I'm desirous of God. And this comes from Revelation, the 3rd chapter, as we read just a moment ago, where they said, I'm rich and I have need of nothing. When God says, no, you're poor and wretched and miserable and blind. They didn't see themselves, and so they were very self-satisfied, and they ended up being lukewarm because of that. They didn't have this desire to please God as they should. That catches us up. The fourth one that we're going to talk about is that I feel more like a servant of God more than a child of God. And as with the other ones that we've talked about, it's not saying that it's wrong to be a servant of God. Obviously, that's a great thing. And God talked about this over and over, and Jesus did. In Mark the 9th chapter, in verse 35, when the disciples are, again, arguing about which one of them is going to be the greatest, what does he tell them? If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and be a servant. Certainly, we need to be servants. In Mark the 10th chapter, when they're arguing again about who's going to be the greatest, he says, whoever would be great among you must be your servant. So please understand that we are to be servants of God we've seen as we studied the life of Paul that that's something that he reveled in, is the idea that he was a servant of God. I love the passage in Luke 17 where the parable that Jesus tells is of a servant who's out plowing the field or keeping the sheep, and he comes in at the end of the day. He says the master doesn't say to him, sit down at the table and I'll make you a meal. The master says, go cook me supper. Right? I would tell him, wash your hands and cook me supper. And at the end of the day, what does the servant say? I'm just an unprofitable servant. I've done just what I'm told to do. And that kind of gets more to the attitude that we struggle with. In Luke 15, you'll recall Jesus tells the parable of a son who leaves his father and goes away to a far country with the father's inheritance. He's very rich at this point, and he wastes all of that money that his father has given to him. So we call it often the prodigal son, but it would fit better if we called it the lost son, because it fits with the two previous parables. When the son comes to an understanding, all the money's spent, all of his friends are gone, and he's feeding pigs and wanting to eat pig food. It says he comes to himself in verse 17. But when he came to himself, this is not what he intended for his life. And so he thinks back to his father, and his father, he thinks of his father and says, my father's servants have bread and to spare, and so I'm going to go back to my father. I want you to read with me in verse 19. He says that he's going to say to his father, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your servants, your hired servants. There are times, even in our service to God, that we feel like servants, not sons. And by servant in this case, I'm thinking about someone who does the things they're supposed to do just out of a sense of duty more than a sense of joy. So our worship and the things that we do become habitual, they become ritual. And so, for example, when it's time to assemble together for the saints, I'm here because I'm expected to be here, but I'm doing it because I have to, and not because, yay, I get to worship God and I get to be with other saints, and here we are worshiping Him together and glorifying Him, and that thrills me. So the danger is that when we think of ourselves as just servants, and that we're doing it just because we have to, that we don't have as much zeal in the things that we do. I think about the Israelites in the wilderness as they were traveling to the land that God had promised them. He's brought them out of the oppression of Egypt, the horrible slavery that they were in there, and He's bringing them to the land that He's promised them. And how do they spend most of that time? As far as I can find, after the crossing of the Red Sea was the one joyous song that they sang. The rest of that time is characterized by grumbling, complaining. God, we don't have enough food. God, we don't have enough water. God, you're going to kill us out here. God, I wish we could go back home because at least we had onions in the pot. They were doing these things, but it was all grumbling, not praise. And in part, it makes sense to me. I mean, going through the wilderness was difficult for them. That was a lot of people and a lot of animals, and it was a desert. But all they did was complain. I also remember Habakkuk, who gives the different picture. In Habakkuk, the 3rd chapter, verses 17 through 19. Now, Habakkuk was a prophet at a time when Judah was about to be taken into captivity. And things were bad in Jerusalem. I mean, the people of Jerusalem were following idols and they were disregarding God. And Habakkuk had come and asked God a question. Why, God, aren't you doing something about Judah? And God says, I'm sending the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says, they're worse than we are. How can you allow that to happen? And God says, be still and know that I'm God. Be silent. The Lord is in his holy temple. Be silent. That's the one. I quoted the wrong one from the Psalms. And in essence, Habakkuk learns to accept those thoughts. And you see that clearly in Habakkuk, the 3rd chapter, verse 17, as he's ending that. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the field, and there be no herd in the stalls. Now understand for a moment what he's saying there with all those things. There's no figs, there's no fruit, there's no olives, there's no sheep, there's no cows. Everything fails. So what is he talking about happening? We're all going to die because we're starving to death. Nothing, everything has gone wrong, and there's nothing to eat. And he says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in Jehovah. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Jehovah, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. Instead of grumbling like the Israelites, what does he say? I'm going to rejoice in God. Even when everything has gone wrong, I'm going to do that. I'm going to rejoice in him. So when we feel more like a servant, we're going to see ourselves grumbling. I got to do this, I got to do that, instead of rejoicing in God like we should. But Luke 15 also tells us another reason we sometimes struggle with this. The words of the Son, when he says, I'm no longer worthy to be a son. And all of us understand that, don't we? That feeling that because of the sins that I've committed, the ways that I have opposed God, even when I, not just as before I was a Christian, but even after a Christian, sometimes my mouth gets away from me. My temper gets away from me. I act in ways that I know are not like my Lord would have me to. This lost son is saying, I'm not worthy to be your son. Really what he's saying is, I can't meet his standards. I can't be the son he wants me to be. So why should I try? I'm just going to be a servant. I'm just going to fly under the radar. Oh, that's so sad, isn't it? There are times when we feel like that I'm more of a servant than a son. And I think that leads me to being lukewarm. But I love how the Father responds. When the Son starts his spiel, tells him to accept me as a hired servant, not a son, what does he say? In the middle of him, the Son doesn't even get to finish. He brings him the robe, and he brings the sandals, and he brings the ring that all say that you are my son. And he says in Luke 15, verse 24, for this my son was dead and is alive again, and he was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Understand that, yes, you are a servant of God, but you are also a child of God. And that is something you and I should celebrate, that God also celebrates. It is a joyous thing for us to think of ourselves as sons and daughters of God. It's a beautiful picture. I like the way that Jesus talked about this to his disciples in John the 15th chapter. This is the night that he's betrayed and he's about to leave them. And he says, I no longer call you servants, for the servant doesn't know what his master is doing. But I've called you friends, for all that I've heard from the Father I've made known to you. I'm not going to call you servants, I'm going to call you friends. This changes our relationship with God, doesn't it? When we think, I'm not just a servant that has to do what the master's told me to do, but I'm his son, and I do this because I love him. I'm his child, I'm his friend, and I'm a servant. And I'm happy to serve because I serve a Father who's worthy of those things. Sometimes we can fall into that trap. So keep thinking you're a son. The last reason that I think we get this idea of lukewarmness is to give God all my leftovers, but not my all. And this is a great danger. And this is, I think, exactly what we see in the book of Haggai. where the people were putting up their paneled houses again, but the temple of God was in ruins. In the book of Hosea, that was written to the northern tribes of Israel, in the 13th chapter, God talks to them about his relationship with them. And he goes back again to the wilderness. Let's start reading in verse 4. But I am Jehovah your God. From the land of Egypt you knew no God but me. And besides me, there is no Savior. He's established the relationship, hasn't he? I'm God. You don't have anyone who saved you but me. I'm the one that came in and did that. It was I who knew you in the wilderness, in the land of drought. But when they had grazed, they became full. Now clearly a change has taken place, right? This is when they get into the land that God had promised them. And it says now they've grazed and they're full. And listen to what happens. They were fooled and their hearts were lifted up. Therefore, they forgot me. Isn't this the picture of becoming very comfortable in our relationship with God? That we would go to a point where we forget our salvation and our Redeemer? And we do that because we become so comfortable. When it was hard, don't get this wrong, but maybe when it was hard, at least they were grumbling and complaining against God. They knew he was there. But at this point, they forgot him. And in that forgetting, of course, that fullness, that means they don't honor him. And so they, of course, don't give him their all. Malachi wrote close to the same time as Haggai, a little bit later. It's the last book in the Old Testament. In Malachi, the first chapter, and in verse 8, he talks to them about how they are not honoring him either as father or master. And he asks them this question. When you offer blind animals in sacrifice, is that not evil? And when you offer those that are lame or sick, is that not evil? Present that to your governor. Will he accept you or show you favor, says Jehovah God? See, the problem that he's pointing out here is that when it came time to offer sacrifices, what sacrifices did they bring? They brought the blind and the lame and the sick. In other words, no great loss. They were offering God less than what he deserved. And I love how he makes the very human example. If you brought this to your governor, some guy who was right there in front of you, would he be pleased with you? Of course the answer is no. He would look at that and say, you've got a better sheep than that one. You bring it. But see, they knew that when it came to their governor, but they didn't honor God that same way. And isn't that a dangerous way of forgetting God and becoming very lukewarm in our relationship with God? That we dishonor him in that kind of way. It's tragic. So he says in verse 10, "Oh, that there were one among you who would shut the doors, that you might not kindle fire on my altar in vain. I have no pleasure in you, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will not accept an offering from your hand." When you try to offer God your leftovers, he doesn't want it. That's why he says, I would rather have you cold or hot, but I don't want you lukewarm. Lukewarm is what brings that blind sheep and says, here you go, God, be thankful. I did what I was supposed to do. Shut the doors. I don't want it. But the people thought that they were pleasing him. God wants all. Look at Matthew, the 22nd chapter. We, of course, recall that the lawyer comes to Jesus and asks which is the great commandment in the law. And Jesus' response in verse 37, Matthew 22:37 is, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." The Jews were familiar with this passage, but they struggled with it. We're familiar with this passage, but I think we struggle with it. We have to, want to give God our all. The example this brings to mind to me, because it's not just about quantity or quality. We need to get that straight based on what we've said. Remember the widow who brings to the offering to the temple her 2 mites, 2 pennies, 2 almost nothing, but it was all that she had. And at that same time, there were those other people who were throwing down vast amounts that they were giving. But Jesus said they were giving of what was extra. And he said she put in more than all of them. Because it's not just about quality and quantity. It's about, do I trust God? Does God have my heart? With all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with your whole being. Do you trust him in that way? And when I do, I'm convinced that it changes my life completely. Isn't that what Paul said in Galatians 2, verse 20? I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Crucified with Christ. Crucified means I've given it all, doesn't it? You can't be kind to crucified. You either are or you are not. It's no longer I who live. You can't do that kind of. You do it completely. But our problem is that we tend to live in this kind of lukewarm area, where it's easy to say those words, but our lives don't reflect them. So when we look at possible ways of thinking about being lukewarm, these are the ones that I struggle with. And like I said, consider your ways. Yours may be different. But a lot of times I'm lukewarm because I fear God, I'm distracted by the world, I'm satisfied with myself, I feel like a servant, and I give God just whatever's there instead of giving my all. When I do that, I feel okay about that. And that's the essence of the lukewarm. To be zealous means I need to love God and be fruitful and desirous of God. I need to think of myself as a child and give him my all. But what all of these do is they remind us that being lukewarm is not about what I'm doing or not doing. Because that's how he started the letter to the people in Laodicea, isn't it? I know your works. It's not just what am I doing or not doing. It's a matter of the condition of my heart and my relationship with God. And don't we see that in all of those things that we looked at, those 5 things, that it was all about relationship. My relationship with God. I need to fall in love with God again. I know, it's awkward to hear that, especially right before Valentine's Day. And it's awkward to hear that because sometimes when we look at the world, we know that when people talk about falling in love, they talk about falling out of love. And they're thinking more about emotion than anything else. But I'm not just talking about that kind of love, but I need to have that passion for Christ again. I need to be in love with him again, the way that he wants me to be. Now, and go back to our text in Revelation, the 3rd chapter. And we see in that passage a solution for this lukewarmness. We have to overcome it. Revelation, the 3rd chapter, helps us. So how do you overcome lukewarmness? There's 2 ways you can go. You can get cold, but that would be bad. So to overcome lukewarmness, you need to be hot, right? So, and we can think of all the other cliches that go with that, right? We need a fire lit under us, and all those cliches. But that's easier said than done. So I want you to notice 4 things that he tells them to do in Revelation 3, beginning in verse 19. His first one is, those whom I love I reprove and discipline, so be zealous. That's not much better than get hot. But be zealous, and I think David's translation used eagerness in that passage. And I like that idea. There needs to be a sense of urgency about this. And that's the problem with lukewarm. there's no sense of urgency. Don't delay. Be zealous. Make these changes. Make them now. Now, part of that is don't just do enough. Choose to excel. I love the passage in Luke, the 6th chapter, when Jesus is drawing comparisons about the kind of people that we should be. He asks us this question. If you love those that love you, what benefit is that to you? Some of the older translations will say, what reward is that to you? What favor is that to you? How does that show you is different? Then he goes on, for sinners love those who love them. He says the same thing for doing good and for lending. And understand what he's saying here. If I just love the people who love me, even people who don't know God will do that. If I'm friends with people who are friends, everybody expects that. I mean, even the worst person in the world, what is that expression? There's honor among thieves, right? They have a certain code even among themselves. What is he urging us in this passage? If he says, what benefit is that to you? What is he saying? We need to, as he goes on to say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, because then you're doing more. You're excelling. You're doing things that the world doesn't know and the world doesn't understand. And it's sad that sometimes even as Christians, we look at those passages and we go, well, that's hard. Or I can't imagine doing that. How am I supposed to love my enemy? If you were in Britain in World War II in London and the Germans were bombing you, could you love Hitler? But that's impossible. How could I love your enemies and do them good and lend to them and pray for those who persecute you? God asks us to do more. We need to be hot. Don't just do enough. Understand that God calls you to do more. And to do that, we're going to have to get to that point where we delight in God. Where we have this deepness of his law and his being in who we are. Think of your relationship with God as a blessing, not as a burden. It's so much more. Understand this about zeal. It's so much more than an emotion where I'm enthusiastic about something. All of us understand this. There are times when I'm happy. There are times when I'm sad. And I go through, you can ask Connie, ranges of these emotions, right? Emotions change. Zeal can, that enthusiasm can change. Sometimes, Earl can tell you this, sometimes it changes in the middle of a song where we start off a song and we're really gung-ho, and by the end of the third verse, he's having to drag us along. It doesn't take long for us to struggle with these things. Emotions change. Zeal's a choice. It is a determination and a dedication to someone, to God. And it is active and deeply rooted in our character. Don't be thinking here when I'm saying be zealous, just have this emotion where all the time you're always happy and everything's good, because that doesn't last. Also, I sometimes find those people annoying because I think they're fake. Isn't that true? That's not what he's telling us to do. He's not telling us fake it. He wants us to be zealous. He wants us to be hot. And that's a determination. I'm always going to be passionate for Christ and dedicated to accomplishing what he wants me to accomplish. So in Romans, the 12th chapter, verse 11, don't be slothful in zeal, but be fervent in spirit. I look at this and I think it's genius. Slothful in zeal. I mean, can you think of two things that are more opposite of each other? The sloth that slowly moves along and just, plods. He says, don't be slothful in zeal. Is it even possible? Be fervent. Be hot in your spirit. Be fervent for God. What work does God want me to do? What gift have I been given? And am I using that gift? And am I growing that gift to his glory? And it's not about saying always I'm ecstatic about this, but am I dedicated to this? Am I going to keep with it? The second thing that he tells them to do in Revelation, the 3rd chapter, so be zealous and repent. Understand that lukewarmness needs to be repented of. It needs to be repented of because the repentance he's talking about here is a change of mind, a change of attitude. Recognize that we've deceived ourselves like they had deceived themselves. Make real changes in your attitude and your actions so that you can be dedicated to God and His work. The other thing he says to them in verse 20 is, if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. Open the door. Isn't that the problem sometimes with lukewarmness? We're sitting in the lazy boy at home and the doorbell rings and it's like, well, I really don't want to get up to answer the door. I'm really comfortable here. But do you see the invitation? Jesus is at the door. I want to open that door, and I want that relationship. And he says, I'll come in, and we'll eat together, and we'll be together. That's not going to happen if you don't open the door. Lukewarmness says, it's okay. Just be comfortable, be steady. Go open that door. Again, easier said than done. But we need to open that door to Jesus and say, you are the one in my life. And I am dedicated to you, to your will, and what you want me to do. And in the last part, he uses the idea of conquer or victorious. The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit on my throne, as also I have conquered and will sit on my soldier's throne, or my father's throne. I was looking at my notes. The idea of being victorious or conquering takes us back to the idea of a soldier. Remember, we looked at that passage in 2 Timothy in the previous lesson, where he says, no soldier gets entangled in civilian pursuit, since his aim is to please the one who enlisted him. Soldiers who are double-minded, who don't seek to please the one who enlists them, don't conquer. Because if I'm out in the field, understand, this is my imagination, having never been a soldier, but if I'm in the field, and I'm out there and I'm trying to fight the enemy, and I'm worried about what's happening back at home with wife and kids and family, and I'm concerned what's going to happen with the enemy. As I'm thinking about that, he's taking aim on me. Because I'm not considering myself, and I'm not being alert, and I'm not doing the things that I need to do. If you're going to conquer, you're not going to conquer lukewarm. You've got to conquer because you're hot. You have to desire that victory. You have to desire that win. And that's not a short thing. Many battles will happen, but it's a war. And that means you have to keep going. Now, not ever having been a soldier, the movie that impacted me the most on that was Saving Private Ryan. If you ever saw that show where they start on D-Day on the beach at Omaha, and they barely survived that, and they work their way all the way into the interior, and they have a very specific job to do. And as they're doing that, their friends are dying, and bad things are happening, and it's hard. But they keep going. Because it's not about just winning a battle. It's about winning the war. In that show, they were zealous for Saving Private Ryan. That didn't mean they were always happy about it, or that it was easy, but they were dedicated to accomplishing that. And I think we need to be hot like that. So some questions to ask yourself for today. Do I really love God? Am I being fruitful for God? Am I seeking God earnestly? Am I walking as a son of God? Am I completely His? If your answer to any of those questions has any hint of lukewarmness in it, be zealous and repent. What changes do I need to make today so that I can be zealous and please God? We want to offer the invitation this morning to anyone who's here. Perhaps you find yourself in this place where you are lukewarm, where you've been serving God for years and years and years, and it's a struggle. Or you've just become a Christian, and it's not easy. You thought it might be easy. If you need our prayers and help, we want to help you. Let us, because we can help you out in those things. The Hebrew writer tells us that one of the things we need to do is to lift up the arms of those who are struggling, those who are weak, and strengthen the feeble knees. We need to be ready to help each other when we all are struggling with this lukewarmness. If you need our prayers, let us know. We want to offer an invitation. If you're not a child of God, make this the day that you become a child of God. Believe and repent and be baptized, and you can be His. Come forward if you're subject to the invitation. Oh.